Yesterday I watched the report, I think it was yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, of Roddy Rosenstein, and he announced this indictment of these dozen Russians as part of the special prosecutor probe and special counsel by Robert Mueller. And from the moment he began talking, I said to myself, this is total crap. And so I downloaded the 29-page document and took a look at each of the charges and the rest of the stuff related to it, and to try to see what it was they were really doing. And my first reaction was that this was a way of covering themselves, saving face, making it look like they were really doing something, and validating all of the crap that we've been told for the last 15 or 18 months regarding the Russians and the probes and the attempt to play games with our election, etc., etc. So, and that it's the Russians that did it. And not only the Russians did it, the Russian government that did it. So effectively what this indictment does, it names these 12 guys. And of course they are all in absentia. You know, it's a grand jury indictment, and so they would be in absentia at least as far as the physical presence of them anyway. That would be true of somebody in Utah. But these guys are all in Russia, which is very convenient, right? Because that means there'll never be a trial. Unless Putin extradites these folks, there will never be a trial. So what do you think the possibility of that is, right? This is a beautiful, empty indictment. And as many have said, a federal grand jury indictment, you could get a prosecutor that would convince people to indict a ham sandwich. So what does it mean? It means absolutely nothing. But what it does mean, that has nothing to do with the indictments or the charges or the claims or the substance of it, is what are they doing? And this is what I went to look at. What is it that they're doing to play games to cover their tails? And so they've listed these guys, these 12 guys, and they go in detail into who each of these guys are. And that they were working from March of 2016 through the end of the election, and that some of their activities actually carried over into 2017, and that they began to spearfish a whole bunch of connections, including, of course, John Podesta, that they don't name. They never name him as one of the victims, right? But it's clear from everything that we already know that John Podesta was one who had received a Google request to update his password, as I recall. And so he followed on it and gave him his password and updated it, and they had it. And once they had it, they got into tens of thousands of John Podesta's emails, and then from there they accessed other things. They also allegedly got into the DNC, and they got into it through private servers. They got into it through various identifications. Excuse me, I'm having a little reaction. And they also got access. They started doing screensavers and key punch identities, which gave them access to other IDs, and supposedly gave them access not only to the communications, the emails, the research, the background, but also to lists of Democratic donors and lists of other Democratic involved and engaged parties. And then from there, they used the spearfishing and spoofing techniques to get access to the rest of the folks. So they named these defendants, and the defendants are, interestingly enough, these guys are majors in the Russian army. Major, here's one. This is assistant head of department. This is a Russian military officer. This is a senior lieutenant in the Russian military. This is a lieutenant in the Russian military, and all of these guys are named, and they're in their departments, and they're in their units, and in various parts of the indictment, they say, well, this is what Alexei did, this is what Yermakov did, this is what Bodin did, and etc., etc. So they spearfished into it and supposedly gained access to 50,000 emails of Podesta's. Now, again, they don't say it's Podesta, but it's pretty obvious. And of course, we have absolutely nothing about the contents or what they used or how they used those contents or which contents were released or about the illegal activity that is observed within the 50,000 emails, right? And then they named victims 1 and 2 and multiple unnamed victims and they supposedly set up the conspirator set up a DC I think it's DCL or DC Leaks, and they supposedly set up a website that was accessed by a million views, where they downloaded some information. They gained access to the Clinton private server this way. They gained access to intermediate servers, and they also gained access to the cloud, allegedly. So what I find fascinating and interesting is that effectively, not only does this show you that it was really the Russian officers and that the Guccifer 2 was all just a fake thing that the Russian officers set up. So the Romanian lone gun, the lone gun outfit of the Russians that was actually just a Romanian that did all this by himself, is actually a subterfuge, and they attempt to show it through all the process. They also show that they stole the credentials of a DC of a Democratic Committee chairman employee, and that they gained access to the network as a result. So it wasn't Seth Rich at all, right? It wasn't Seth Rich that did this. And then they gained access to fundraising and financing, although who knows what they did with it. I mean, it's supposed to be public and legal anyway, so why would they look at that stuff? So they supposedly got into 33 computers, and they got into multiple employees of the Democratic Committee. Now, here's another piece that I found fascinating, which covers their trail about the Seth Rich business, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. So Rosenstein shows here, through Mueller and through this indictment, that these Russians were so smart that they used effectively a zip drive, that is, to consolidate and tighten the contents so that they could outsource it much quicker and by making it smaller. Well, we know that it was outsourced quickly, and we know that it was probably outsourced through a thumb drive, but in order for Rosenstein to make this look plausible, they had to zip drive this stuff in order to get it out. So there is that. They had made attempts to hide their activity, and they hired they faked it and used a number of email addresses, a whole range of email addresses, and they ran money in and out of Bitcoin, which is pretty interesting, according to the claims here, right? And so I'm going to have some discussion about Bitcoin in a minute. So despite the conspirators' efforts to hide their activity, there was a company which eventually the Democrats hired to look into how they were being hacked, the fact that they thought they were being hacked. And of course the company went into the look at the extent of the intrusions, to block the intrusions allegedly, and to keep any more intrusions from occurring. But despite that, according to these guys, these Russians kept hacking and whacking all around through the process. And one of the words they use, I find this absolutely fascinating, is that they called this, the conspirators registered the domain wikileaks.com through a service that anonymized. I don't know what anonymized means. Made anonymous? Oh, anonymized. Anyway, so they also used cloud providers, and they allegedly had their own cloud stuff, and then they took the DC cloud stuff, transferred it from the DC cloud identity to their cloud, and they were able to access it and exit it through there. So they set up this DCleaks.com, which some of you may have actually looked at, supposedly had 1 million hits, 1 million page views, and before it was shut down in March of 2017. So this thing claims, these guys claim that these Russians set up DC Leaks and that it ran clear till March of 17, even though the claims of Guccifer and the rest of that goes clear back to mid-16, right? So these brilliant FBI guys were unable to identify DC Leaks until March of 17 when it was shut down. So that's just absolutely crazy. They also make two notes in this indictment that these guys accessed and got Republican Party details, and that they got access to a number of Republican Party documents. They also attempted to access it. But there is absolutely nothing said about the Republicans. Nothing. About what they sourced, how they got access, how much access they got, what documents they might have gotten. And apparently, these 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 guys working for Mueller never bothered to look at that. Neither did the FBI, which I found absolutely fascinating. Now they said, and this is the big thing about the Guccifer too, that all of these Russians took all of their stuff and they attempted to siphon it through to Guccifer, and that they titled it as Guccifer 2 and created this thing. So 2 years ago, when we were allegedly being protected by our own federal government, and they rounded Guccifer 2 up and they brought him in and they had him testify and all the rest of that, it took them 2 years to figure out that it wasn't Guccifer that did it, right? Yeah, that's a good one too. Oh God, this stuff is just absolutely crazy. So then they say that there's a candidate for the Congress that these Russians allegedly got a hold of, and this candidate for U.S. Congress asked for documents from them. That's the end of what we hear about that. Were their documents transferred? No, there's no comment about it. Then they apparently registered and tried to get access to some state lobbyists online, and that also there's nothing more said about it. Then in August, they said that this Guccifer, posing as Guccifer, supposedly sent documents to a newsman related to Black Lives Matter, and that's all they say about that. So that they also note, and this is fascinating because Rosenstein doesn't make any comment about it, but these guys posing as Guccifer got a hold of the presidential Trump campaign, sent a document or two, and the person in the campaign said, in response to these guys, pretty standard stuff. So they didn't nibble on it at all. They didn't bite on it at all. So we've spent 15 or 18 months allegedly looking at the connections between the Russians and these crazy guys that have stolen all this stuff from the Democrats and Clinton and Podesta and the rest of that, and how linked they are to the Trump campaign. And yet here we are, the conspirators posing as Guccifer attempted to make contact with the presidential campaign, and the presidential campaign said, nothing there. So here's one that I absolutely found fascinating, is that they used, allegedly, these conspirators, these same nasty 12 Russians that are all in Russia, that have all been indicted, that have absolutely no potential for showing up on our shores or in our courtrooms, that these guys use Bitcoin to obtain a virtual private network to attempt to hide their transmissions. All right, so this is the most sophisticated, this is absolutely unbelievable, right? So this is the most sophisticated Russian governmentally operation that is running a network that is using all of these high operatives to gain access to the presidential campaign of the #1 country in the world, and they're going to hide all their stuff, but they're using a publicly operated virtual private network to hide their transactions. Now, in some other point in this, they say, well, gee, they hopped all over the world. They used this and that source in order to gain, in order to hide or obscure their identities. And then they say, we used a VPN. Yeah, right. You used one VPN and you bought it with Bitcoin, and that's the way that you were going to hide yourself from the federal government of the United States. Yeah, give me a break on that one. So then they also note that there was a reporter that was working, that the conspirators sent the reporter a password to gain access to non-public information, to a private information source. Now, finally, not finally, but we get to the organization #1, which I'm going to say to you might be WikiLeaks, right? And so what these guys say without saying it, because organization #1 is not ever identified, is that they send a whole bunch of stuff regarding the presidential election to organization #1. And that organization #1 supposedly transferred, released documents on July 22nd, 2016. Organization #1 released over 20,000 emails. Well, who do you suppose that was? And then again on October 7th, organization #1 released a whole bunch of campaign, the first set of emails of the Clinton campaign that had been stolen by these co-conspirators. So, again, who's organization #1? And basically what this says is that organization #1 got all this information from these 12 co-conspirators posing as Guccifer, and that all of this stuff was faked through, right? Then they have a bunch of stuff about statutory activity and their violations and the rest of that, and allegedly this is more than $5,000 worth of stuff, and that there are statutory violations for, they aggregate the $5,000, and that all of these 12 did more than $5,000 worth of damage within a year to private networks, and that they used both money laundering, money transferring, and identification theft to gain access to that. So that's what these guys were doing. They're money laundering and victim identification. So the other one that I find fascinating, and I think it is something to bear for all of our cryptocurrency guys to bear notice to, is that they traced all of the Bitcoin, that the federal government, the special prosecutor, traced all this Bitcoin stuff from one identity to the other. They traced how they did it by mining, how they did it by transferring, how they did it across multiple nations, how they did it with access to individual accounts, and who used all of these email accounts when they were buying stuff, how they used those Bitcoin sources to make payment. So it's all secret and nobody can get access to it, right? I don't think so. So that ought to tell you, crypto guys, that if the federal government can trace these guys doing all of their Bitcoin and mining and transferring and using hundreds of different email accounts to access this, they still knew everything about their transactions, allegedly. Allegedly, right? So they can trace everything that's in it. All the Bitcoin was followed. That's the fact of it. So I find this absolutely incredulous, fascinating. It basically, what I'm going to say to you is, first of all, that it took Rosenstein, Steinstein, and Mueller 15 or 18 months to come up with this story. And with this story, they allege that they've done all this work to find these guys and that they've linked all this stuff, and that this stuff that's been linked is absolutely the answer to everything that went on. Now, they also said in the public announcement is that we have no proof at all that anything was, that it altered the campaign. But of course, in the process of this, and not in the process of the public announcement, do they identify organization number one, which has to be WikiLeaks, right? Which had an impact on some of the narrative of the middle and fall of 2016. And it also had to do with the Guccifer and all the rest of this, and Podesta's emails and the release of those kinds of things. So they're going to say, well, we can't say that there was anything about that, but we do. Now, one of my subscribers sent me some information and links that claim where there isn't a guy that's identified who is anonymously identified, and there is an interview of him. And if any of you want it, just put it in there, and I'll post it if I should be able to find it in my comments. And this witness alleges that he is a government insider and that he has access, and that the guys who actually snuffed Seth Rich bragged to him as to what they did. And he also goes on to say that these guys are operatives. I'm just quoting this guy. I'm not saying this actually happened, Rosenstein, that these operatives worked for the FBI and specifically worked for Rosen, and that they took Seth Rich out as part of the plan. So this works perfectly, right? To take Seth Rich out of the middle of all this. None of this stuff that was hacked or leaked or gained access to that went to WikiLeaks came from Seth Rich. And so now we have diffused the whole Seth Rich controversy because it's the 12 Russians who did it. And we know that the 12 Russians did it and how they were lined up. And so if you recall, a year and a half ago when this stuff all allegedly came up, there were guys like Brennan that claimed that 16 agencies all thought the Russians intruded, and et cetera, but they never brought any proof. And so now we have this alleged proof and this alleged indictment, and we have here 12 ham sandwiches, right? 12 ham sandwiches. And so if you want to start a deli, I'll sell this document to you so you can sell the 12 ham sandwiches. It's total nonsense. And Rosenstein is using this to cover his patoot, and he is also trying to justify his appointment of Mueller as special counsel and the whole special counsel probe into the Russian stuff. Interestingly, they released this and announced this, a day or two before Trump meets with Putin in Finland. So it has an interesting consequence, and they acknowledged that Trump had been briefed and that Trump, that Trump knew what was going on. And then when Trump was questioned, Trump said, yes, of course, I am going to challenge Putin and I'm going to tell him to stop doing this. Well, I'm not sure from having read this that there's any more proof, not one item of proof that the Russians did it. Am I saying that the Russians didn't try to hack stuff? No. Am I saying the Russians didn't get access to Hillary's emails? No. I'm saying they probably did. They probably got access to a whole bunch of people's stuff, and they probably did all kinds of things to attempt to get access. One of the other things I failed to point out in here is that there were numerous attempts allegedly made by this same bunch of Russians to get in both into the operations of election operations of numerous states, and another organization, a vendor who monitors and collects election data that follows up on the process. And I'm going to tell you that's probably Diebold, and it's probably Soros related, and it's probably trying to cover the ass of Soros. So what I conclude when I get all done with this is that probably none of this is true as it relates to any substantive matter. None of it is true as it relates to all the stuff that these guys have been telling us all along. None of it has gravitas for what they claim that's been done. It covers the Seth Rich stuff. It covers for Podesta and the DC Democratic Committee, Presidential Committee and Election Committee. It covers for the stuff that allegedly went on with the elections and the vendors and the attempted intrusions, and it covers for all the rest of this stuff. And it's an interesting, plausible story which has holes in it everywhere and which has almost no vitality. And if this were true, they could have released this in November of 16, if this were true, because it would have been patently obvious. And if Brennan actually had a real story to tell, they could have released this stuff. If this had any merit, they could have released it within a week or two of the election, and perhaps a month or 2 or 3 months before, if any of it were true. It doesn't take 18 months to come up with a phony 12 ham sandwich Russian deal story that supposedly covers their patoot. So I'm not buying it. And if the anonymous witness of the Seth Rich killing is true, it wasn't MS-13 that did it. It was the dark side, the dark underbelly of the FBI and the bad guys that were tied in, perhaps, with Rosenstein, Steinstein, as part of the process. And once again, we've covered and obfuscated and hidden the stuff. So I hope this is helpful to you. If you like it, give a thumbs up. It is a crazy story, and once one gets red-pilled, you take your pill and you look at this and you say, no, this doesn't hold water. It just doesn't hold water. Thanks for watching.